Thank you for joining us for this month's coffee talk. Let me turn on my camera. I hope everyone's doing well today. Thank you for joining us. My name's Sean O'Brien, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks again for joining us, everyone, this morning. As Sean said, my name is Steve Huntington. I'm the Director of Analytics here at QwickRate. My background, I spent my entire career working solely with community financial institutions and in everything from strategic planning and valuation work to M&A and capital planning, as well as model design and maintenance. And I've spent the last 10 years or so working with Sean and QwickRate to try to take that those types of products and put them into a more practical environment for credit unions.
Great, thanks, Steve. Just a reminder, our format is designed for you to present and submit questions for us. The most effective ways are through the Q&A box and the chat feature. We will monitor those and take those during the call or an appropriate break from the presentation that Steve will have on a few points within CECLSolver. That's really our goal here today, and has been monthly, is to provide you with a forum beyond just the day-to-day interactions with our customer service team or our sales team, to just answer any questions that you might be encountering or questions you might have as we work through this CECL transition. Steve, you want to just briefly discuss, the solver, and then we'll get into start to take questions.
Yeah, I know most of you on the call today are familiar with the tool, but for those of you who are not, I'll just very briefly remind everybody that we're utilizing our CECL tool heavily utilizes the weighted average remaining maturity, or the WARM method. Certainly one of the more straightforward methodologies that's been vetted by the powers that be and approved for most credit unions for CECL compliance. We have some elements of some of the other methodologies, most notably the snapshot open pool methodology, but it's mostly a WARM type method. Our entire tool lives in the cloud. What that means to you is that when you log into the tool, you see all of your historical data, balances, charge-offs, recoveries, et cetera, are already preloaded into the system whenever you log in. Whenever you file and everybody else files their call reports every quarter, all the historical data is automatically updated as soon as it's available from the NCUA, which is a much quicker process to be, which is convenient from a CECL perspective. And again, that's all possible because we start our segmentation around what's available to us on the call reports. We do have a little bit more granularity available than we did before because of the recent changes early this year to the structure of the asset quality data in the call reports. We certainly give the ability to add custom risk pools and really customize the report whenever your situation sort of would require it. But it's very straightforward. We do weighted average remaining maturity calculations by call report segment. We work with you to do that, to do those calculations. And then the tool helps you calculate lifetime historical loss trends in your portfolio. It provides external environmental data in the form of apples to apples historical peer data, as well as some economic data, helping inform and justify your qualitative factor adjustments, which is the name of the game under CECL. And then we allow you to modify it as need be so that we can do a straightforward CECL calculation, taking into account any individually assessed loans that are necessary or unfunded commitments or held maturity securities. Managing on the next slide, Sean, just from a management standpoint, you save scenarios, you build a scenario. As soon as you save it, the data is remembered forever. It never gets lost. You can build as many scenarios as you want. We highly suggest every time there's new data or new information, you save it as a new scenario, right? We don't want to be overriding and overwriting our one scenario every month or every quarter when we get new data, because we want to be able to look back on our old scenarios to see what it looked like at the time we built it. Right? There's plenty of times where you're going to want to see what was the reserve under CECL 6 months ago, and then 3 months ago, and then today, and follow the trajectory over time. You can't do that if you're modifying old scenarios and then saving them over. So make sure that you're saving them as new scenarios so that the old scenarios are intact as of the point in time, frozen in time, so to speak, as of when you saved them. So their historical integrity is left intact. Also make notes. I know you've probably, if you've heard me, you've heard this from me and Sean as well, but it's all, the process is document, document, document. You know, we can't tell you how many times we've heard, I mean, directly from the lips of auditors and examiners that almost it's less important where you end up as it is than it is to have some documentation and narrative around how you ended up there, right? We're all making a lot of assumptions in CECL because they're asking us to project the future going well out into the future. So it's really much more about how you justify the assumptions that you make and then being able to clearly see when and where you've done that. So our tool allows you to make notes at the segment level in different areas throughout it. And the more of that you do, the better off you'll fare in an exam, in an audit. And then just 6 months from now, when you come back to update your tool, or 3 months, to remind you what you were thinking when you made those assumptions or those adjustments last quarter, right? So it's internal and externally important to make notes as you go. So yeah, we have relatively recently, we've updated the Q factors tab just to have a lot of those, to make reference to the suggested qualitative factor adjustments that have been part of our interagency regulatory guidance for decades now. The tool used to be a little thinner on the Q factor side and just ask the users to come up with the Q factors as they saw fit. But we thought it would be helpful to kind of preload the system with all those other suggested qualitative factor adjustments. You can modify them, you can remove them. You know, if you don't have any Q factors based upon changes in lending policies or procedures, simply remove that column. There's a little red trash can right on the top of it. You can modify or remove any of the columns as you see fit.
Steve, a couple of questions have come in. I want to go back to the slide.
Okay.
There was a question, can we go back and put assumptions for March of 2022?
Absolutely. So you can, one great thing about our tool, it is very easy to roll back the clock, meaning if you wanted to do a CECL calculation as if it was March 31st, 2022 right now, you can very easily do that. What you would do is you'd plug in your balances. You know, if I can I draw on here? I can. Look at that.
Can you draw?
Yeah, I'm covering it's purple-ish. Fuchsia? I'm not sure. Anyway, yes. So if you want, you can come in here. When you first open up a scenario, this is going to be the most recent call report balances, but you can certainly override these. These would be June 30th right now. Override these, put in your March 31st balances, and then just type in March 31st here so that you remember that. And then you would, hold on, let me clear those. Then you'd come over to, no, I'm trying to draw here. Then you'd come over to the historical analysis tab, and then on the right-hand side of the historical tab are drop-down boxes for dates that allow you to modify the look back period. So you'd want to roll the clock back and take your look back periods and shift them so they're not taking into account June 30th data, right? So you would just click on there's a green button there that allows you to shift the entire look back period back to March 31st. As soon as you do that, then the entire historical record will roll back to as if it was March 31st now. And then at that point, between your current balances being March 31st and all your historical data and your peer data being March 31st, then you would, in effect, have a CECL calculation as of March 31st. And you save it, when you save that scenario, give it a name and put March, as of March 31st in the scenario name so that you remember that, just as a, best practice.
Great. A couple more questions, Steve. One, are you able to provide a short explanation for each factor on the Q factors that are included in the tool?
That's the exact, we just had that question earlier today from a different institution, and that's a good question. So right now, yeah, stay right there. What they're referring to is, as of now, you can make notes by segment in your Q factors if you want to make, build that narrative as to why did I make a 20 basis point adjustment for economic conditions on my mortgage loans? And why did I make these adjustments? You can make notes at the segment level and attach them to the tool. But right now, the tool doesn't allow you to make notes at the column, like make a note here, for example, so where you're kind of explaining the adjustment you're making for lending and lending policies and procedures across the board. The best way to handle that right today, since that doesn't exist today, is when you're done with a scenario, export the tool to Excel. So when you click on the export button, you can export to PDF or to Excel. You can just choose an Excel export. And once you do that, then this will be in an Excel environment. You can simply, add your notes directly to the bottom of the column in the Excel environment. So that's a kind of a practical way to do it today. But we're going to look into how we might build it interactively into the system, because I do think that's a good suggestion. The challenge we always have in these types of kind of open-ended updates where the user can put in 4 words or 3 paragraphs is how do we solve for somebody putting in 3-paragraph explanation and then they want to export the tool to a PDF and it has to fit on a piece of paper. So that's always a challenging. That's not your problem. That's our problem. But it's a challenging one sometimes, and we'll look into how we can solve that.
Yeah, and just a reminder, these Q factor suggestions, these are not, you don't have to make an adjustment for all of these, right? These come from a list of ones that are often commonly used in some form or fashion in the ALLL, and we'll be able to continue to do that with CECL. But, I think it's important to note, you don't have to make an adjustment for all of these. You can just, utilize the ones and the adjustments you want to or you need to make for. So
I think we can hit the first one if you want, Sean. Happy to discuss it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's I'm sorry,
the day one.
Day one, yeah. So that's where I was gonna go, Steve. Thanks. Do you know anything about the one-time CECL adjustment for our allowance?
So yeah, so let me explain briefly. I think we talked about that once in the past in a coffee talk. So we have some data out there on it if you want to listen to a larger conversation about it with the opinion of an auditor as well. I think, was it 2 months ago that we talked about it with
I think so.
with an auditor?
Josh,
but
yeah.
to answer the question, when you first are complying with CECL, there's the day one accounting and then day 2 and beyond, right? Everything else accounting. Day 1 accounting works like this. When you make your official adoption of CECL, say in January of next year or whatnot, you're going to do your first full run of a CECL, an ACL based upon the CECL methodology. You will see what that reserve, let's say it comes out at $1 million. And you currently have in your ALLL $900,000. There will be a one-time adjustment on the balance sheet. It will not go through the income statement on day 1. You will have a one-time adjustment into and out of your reserve and your undivided profits or retained earnings. So if you're 100,000 short, that first time you do the analysis, 100,000 will come out of your retained earnings or undivided profits and into the reserve, or vice versa, because you can certainly be have a decrease in your reserve under CECL depending upon your situation and obviously with the blessing of your examiner or auditor. Then everything after that on day 2 and beyond works just like it does today. You do a calculation, you realize what the reserve needs to be, you compare it to your current reserve. If it needs to be higher, you provision for it on the income statement as you would today. So that's how the day 1 versus the everything after. If you're concerned about having a large shortfall on day 1 and having to transfer a large amount of money out of your retained earnings and impacting your capital ratios, there is a transitional accounting that you can sort of opt into. And what that means is over the course of they'll allow you to slowly phase in the effect of that loss of capital.
Oh, Steve just froze. We'll see if he's gonna get back in here.
Did you lose me for a second?
Yeah, we did. As soon as you started to say the phase in over the time period, we lost you. You froze.
Yeah, so I think.
Oh, and you did again. Well, we'll wait for Steve to come back, and I'll let him finish answering the question. If he doesn't come back, then I'll answer it. is the next question is the discussion. Oh, Steve, you're back now.
All right. If it happens again, I'll reset my router and I'll blink out for a minute or two so I can get a cleaner connection. But they'll allow you to phase it in over up to 12 quarters if you want to. It won't change the actual capital amount on your balance sheet, but for calculating your capital ratio for risk-based capital, you can take 1/12 of the difference each quarter up over the course of 12 quarters, and then it'll be fully phased in after 12 quarters. But that's only if you have a significant capital ratio issue with the NCUA, with your examiners.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Next question is, can you discuss about how to make adjustments on Q factors? For example, our historical rate for unsecured credit cards is 9 basis points, while peer weighted is 38 basis points. Should I adjust the net? That's really for you to determine, right? That's one of the reasons we put it there. If you want to use that additional peer information to make a Q factor adjustment, we did that because oftentimes Q factor adjustments can be subjective. Some credit unions prefer to have something a little bit more objective. You don't have to make that adjustment, but it's there to give you an idea of what other credit unions have experienced in the same time frame as you. So it's completely up to you, but we thought it was helpful, objective information that you might, in fact, want to make an adjustment on for your Q factors. Again, I want to stress you don't have to, but it's there if you do choose to use an objective piece of data to make an adjustment. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, it's really all about when you look at that, your 9 basis point credit card loss, is that something you're very confident in that? Excellent, by the way, very low loss on credit cards. Is your customer base the type of customer base where that's going to remain much below peer average? Or do you feel like, hey, we might have gotten a little bit luckier in the past, we think that in the future our losses are going to kind of track a little bit closer to the peer average? So we provide that data there. You decide how much it's relevant to you to take into consideration in your reserve requirement. It's most helpful in situations where you might have zero loss, right? If you've got no losses in mortgages over the last 8 years, but you're not going to get away with having no reserve for your mortgage portfolio. But how do you justify whatever it is based upon your history of zeros, right? It's difficult to do so. So we present the peer data so that you can say, we've had zero losses. Our peers have had 50 basis points in our neck of the woods over the same period. We think we'll continue to outperform our peers, but we recognize there are losses in this segment, in the environment around us. We're going to make a 20 basis point adjustment to move in the direction of peers while still believing we will perform superiorly moving forward. I hope that helps.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. Next question is there anything specific we need to share with our board? Again, that's completely up to you. We give you the ability to fully export the entire CECLSolver. I think, again, internally, that's something you can determine how much information you want or need to share with the board. I think typically the summary page is maybe the net charge-off, historicals, your Q factors, are all, perfectly appropriate to share with your board. But I think it's a question of, again, every institution is going to be a little bit different, but we wanted to give you the ability to share as much or as little as necessary. Steve, anything there?
Nope.
The next question is, if your reserve is higher than the CECL requirement, do you have to make an adjustment even if the board does not want to? So, again, you can have unallocated reserves. The standard doesn't want you to have more or, too much more or too much less than you actually, the methodology calls for. But you can have, an unallocated reserve, if necessary. So I'm not sure that completely answers the question, but I guess the answer is you don't have to make an adjustment if you don't want to. Steve,
you don't have to make an adjustment, but you do have to. You would have to defend. You would have to say that we believe that if you've got $1 million in there and the CECL calculation shows you only need 800,000, but you want to keep $1 million in there, you have to justify $1 million one way or another, right? It has to be your estimate of future losses. Now it's a cat and mouse game. I mean, and there's lots of ways to add in qualitative factor adjustments, especially when the economy's been where it's been and kind of up and down and interest rates are where they are and moving for the first time in a long time. There's lots of space in there to say, we're making an additional 15 basis point, Q factor adjustment across the board because of economic uncertainty that will affect our customers over the short run, right? So those are ways to whether you call them unallocated or don't call them unallocated. If you want to keep your reserve at a number that otherwise the calculation would show as lower, there's lots of ways you can get there. But I don't think if you go to them and say our CECL reserve, this is the math, it needs to be 800,000. We're simply going to keep $1 million in there. I don't think they're going to want it. They're going to want you to justify the $1 million. Otherwise, it shouldn't be $1 million.
Yeah, and I think again it gets back to the kind of the reserve process, right? Your reserves are going to be defined based on your historical numbers plus or minus any Q factor. So to Steve's point, you can adjust the Q factors to effectively get to the number you want in many ways, right? They have to be defensible, but that's ultimately what a Q factor is. It's designed to capture and quantify any risk not measured through your historical numbers, right? That's what a Q factor is all about.
Through your historical numbers, that's the key
Yep.
part there. So you can have almost no losses, but you look around and say, hey, all the other credit unions similar size to us in our state have some serious losses there. So we can easily justify having a Q factor going forward, even if our losses have been negligible in that bucket because of the environment around us in which we operate, right?
That's right. How would you define peer experience and how would you measure this? So that's a question, to the column there on this page. And so again, what we felt like with the peer data, since we provide that apples to apples peer comparison in the CECLSolver, we thought again, to the earlier question, this is a supplemental piece of information that if you wanted to make an objective adjustment based on what other credit unions are experiencing with those particular categories, you could make an adjustment supported by those differences. Steve,
can I share my screen for a second, Sean? Because
Sure,
I think I want to speak to this
sharing.
while looking at our interactive tool for a second. Because I think the peer data is, in my opinion, critical. It's one of the best weapons you have, honestly, in this entire process. And so we present it, I think, in a somewhat unique and very apples to apples meaningful way. So I want to explain that in a little deeper for just a second. I'm going to share my screen.
Yeah, I can see.
All right. So this is I just pulled up the CECLSolver tool for a larger Midwestern credit union. And so the peer data, how do we calculate lifetime historical losses for other credit unions, right? We don't have their WARMs or any of that kind of stuff. And so how are we calculating that? Well, when we did this historical analysis on you, right, where you plug in your WARMs, and then we pull all of your historical call report data so we can track balances, charge-offs, recoveries over all these different look back periods. We're doing this entire process that we're doing for your credit union. We're also doing it for every single other credit union in your peer group simultaneously in the background. So crunching millions and millions of data points in order to get this. What this page represents is, hey, this is the environment in which you operate, right? So we just looked at your history. We looked at your loss rates by bucket going back far enough in time. And now we're going to say, forget about you. How has everyone else operated on an apples to apples basis? So we're looking at all your peer groups loss rates by bucket using the same segmentation and then overlaying your look back periods. So we can calculate a 4-year aggregate loss rate for each of your individual peers just on used vehicle loans. And then we take a weighted average of those for all the peers, and we effectively calculate an average lifetime loss rate based upon your WARMs for your peer group. So it's a somewhat proprietary number, but it's the most perfectly apples to apples comparison to your historical lifetime loss rate, so that you can say, hey, we had losses of, no losses, right? On our student loans, we had 0 losses over the last 7 years. But for other similar sized credit unions, they lost 1.64% on that segment over that same time period. And that gives us the justification, the basis for having some sort of a Q factor adjustment based upon the peer data. So, and we would do it right here, right? We come in here to our Q factors tab. We see our historical loss rate of 0. We now add in some sort of adjustment based upon the peer number. we're not suggesting you just plug in whatever the peer calculation is here, because that would suggest that you're saying, I don't expect to continue performing better than the peer group. I'm simply expect to perform exactly as the peer group did, which is certainly not what we're suggesting you have to do. So it's completely subjective, as is so much in CECL, and completely up to you, but we provide the data that you can defend it.
Steve, we had a follow-up question. Is the peer data based only on other credit unions that are using QuickRate?
So great question. By default, so since we're utilizing, peer data is one of the better pieces of information we have, but we're doing this for our examiners and our auditors. We want to make sure that, the NCUA, our examiners are going to be comfortable with whatever peer data we're using. So we went to the NCUA to see how they organize credit unions and peer groups, and they're pretty straightforward. There's 6 peer groups, right? The NCUA has peer group 1 through peer group 6. One of the smallest credit unions, the guys under 2 million in total assets, all the way up to peer group 6, which is the biggest credit unions, those over 500 million in total assets. We start by using whatever peer group you are in, whatever NCUA peer group you're in. And then we allow you to zoom in or out geographically to say, hey, yeah, all right, I'm in peer group 5 because I'm between 100 and 500 million in assets, but I don't really want to be comparing myself to credit unions on the other side of the country. So I'm going to zoom in just on my region. Those are the 3 regions that the NCUA defined in 2018, I think, when they started moving to regional offices. There was what, north, south, and west. Is that right? I think it was. Or you can zoom into the state level. So if you only want to compare yourselves with 100 or 500 million or 50 to 100 million dollar credit unions in your state, you can zoom in to the state level. I'm going to do that right now. When I click on state, it takes a minute. It took about 15 seconds to update. That's because it's literally pulling 15 years worth of segment level call report data on an entirely new set of credit unions. So no, the peer group is not limited. The peer data is not limited to people that use our tool. Since we're using publicly available call report information, it is a comprehensive peer group based upon your state, region, or nation, and then asset size. And you can change the asset size. If you want to see, hey, I'm in Wisconsin and I'm, 50 to 100 million in size, but I'm almost at 100 million. So I'm close to peer group 5. Should I compare myself with the 50 to 100 million guys in peer group 4? Or should I compare myself to the 100 to 500 million guys in peer group 5? You can toggle between the 2 peer groups and just look and see how it changes things. I mean, putting my analyst hat on, I could have a field day with just the data on this page saying, hey, what happens to credit unions in Wisconsin as they grow when it comes to used vehicle loan loss rates? You can answer that question just by playing around with this tab for a couple minutes. Or how does Wisconsin compare to the rest of the country in mortgage losses, over the last few years? So a lot of good data there that can be used. Sean?
Great. Next question is, we're adopting the QuickRate policy, but does it replace or supplement the ALLL? So yes, you will have a new policy for CECL that will replace, the ALLL policy. Okay, let me close that one out. Let's see if I got all the questions so far. All right, so I think I've answered those. So yes, I think.
I'll stop my share so you can pull up
Let me pull back my
presentation again.
presentation. We'll get back to this. Okay, so we've touched on this. The individually assessed loans, again, we've given you the ability to document there. Steve, you want to add anything here?
Nope. I mean, that's been in the tool for a while now.
Yeah.
It just allows you to deal with them, the ones that you need to cull from the herd and, deal with on a one-off basis. There's a template for it. You may use that a lot. You may not use it very much at all. And it will be a bit of a moving target, I think, as we go through this first year with the NCUA and with your auditors as to what loans are appropriately dealt with that way. Same thing with the held to maturity securities. This won't be much of anything for most of you. Because most of you probably don't have a large portfolio of held to maturity securities that are on the books at cost, right, or at amortized cost. And ones only, and CECL only really applies to expected credit losses, right? So you're looking at credit losses on held to maturity securities. So if you have, government sponsored or government guaranteed securities in your held to maturity, they're still not going to have any credit loss, expected credit loss. The only time is if you have a bunch of corporate debt that really has a risk of actual credit loss on the books. And most credit unions have limited or no exposure there.
Great. A couple more questions here, Steve. May we receive a copy of the presentation? Yes, I forgot to mention that at the top. We will send out, I did start the recording today, so this month. So we will get a copy of the presentation slides as well as a link to the recording. It'll probably be out to you from Jason or David in an email on Monday. It's possible it'll still be this afternoon, but more likely Monday. So you can look for those. Do we have a sample policy we can share? We don't at the moment. We do have some resources in there. This is a question we're getting increasingly, so we will try to work on putting something together. But we have certainly enough information in our resources tab to build a policy, but we are in the process of trying to review some and maybe get a template out there for all of our users. All right, next question is, are the loan segment balances automatically reduced by the individually assessed loan balances? Yes, it is. That's one of the beauties of it. So yes, to that question, we do remove those from the
certainly don't want to be double counting losses. So we make sure that doesn't happen.
All right, Steve, anything here you want to talk about the peer data and the updates?
I think you have on the next, well, there we go. So yeah, some of you are as current users are familiar with this, but I like to remind everybody because it's still somewhat newer, and it's just a convenient way to kind of look over some basic financial data on your credit union or any other credit union in the country. So we figured, hey, since we've got access to and we're warehousing every call report ever filed, we can do a lot more than just asset quality data. And so we're starting to build some templates where you can look at financial performance on over quarter periods, year-to-date periods, annual periods, go back in time, compare it to different peer groups, and look at relative performance. And you can do this on your credit union, or you can search for any other credit union in the country and look at some of their financial data. You can export it to Excel, to PDF, print it off, all that. And in addition to just being a nice practical way to do that, if you're ever curious, it also allows you on the next slide, Sean, to get a feel for who's in your peer group, right? So if you say, hey, I'm in NCUA peer group 4 and I'm in California, so I'm a $50 to $100 million California credit union, that's the peer group I'm using for CECL. Who else is in that peer group and what do they look like? You can go to this page. We call it the Credit Union Universe at a glance. And you can just get a snapshot of all the other similar sized credit unions that are in your peer group. You can sort this by any of the column headers. You can sort it by asset size. You can sort it by profitability, by fee income, by whatever you want, and just get a feel for who are some of the other credit unions that are in that peer group. And if you click on any company's name on any credit union, it will open up their financial overview page with a map of their branches and some of their financial statistics as well. So it's just a convenient way to kind of do some looking around outside your four walls.
So there's a follow-up here on the policy. Yeah, I mean, the ALLL policy, right. I mean, you can certainly use that. You just want to certainly tweak it for all the CECL things, again, that are kind of dropped forward or presented in those resources tabs. We can certainly, Amanda, talk more specifically about it and take a look at your current policy and assist with that.
Yeah, and we're looking for some more specific audit. We're working with some auditing firms to get a good kind of Word documenty template that will give you some good policy language or more than we're providing now in the future. But you can certainly use what we have up there currently until we get it.
For sure. We just know as we get increasing questions, we're going to dig into this a little bit. Okay. So, I think one of the things that we're starting to see as you are all getting deeper into your, preparations for CECL is, just common questions we get. And, one of the ones that we get most often is just how, in fact, are we calculating these historical losses? Single biggest difference between the ALLL and what CECL is doing is we, in the ALLL, focused a lot more just on annualized losses. In the WARM methodology in CECL, we're looking at losses over a lifetime of loan, and that lifetime is defined by the remaining maturity of these portfolios. So I thought it would be helpful, and Steve's going to kind of walk you through how we calculate those those losses, the net charge-offs. Steve?
Yeah, so I think there's sometimes we often hear some confusion where people say, I was looking at your tool and it tells me my loss rate on mortgage loans or on vehicle loans is 3%. Now, how can that be? I've never had more than 60 basis points in 1 year, and you're telling me my loss rate is 3%. It's because we're talking about an aggregate lifetime loss rate, not an annual one, not an average one over time, but the actual aggregate. So if you had 60 basis points per year for 5 years, that would be a 5-year aggregate loss rate of 3%. So we are unannualizing or de-annualizing the data from a CECL perspective by definition. And well, then we hear kind of a follow-up sometimes. People say, well, I've seen some other CECL tools that show average annual loss rates. Well, that's fine. You can certainly get an average annual loss rate, but then you have to multiply that by your WARM, by your remaining life to get, so it's 2 different ways of getting at an aggregate multi-year lifetime loss rate, right? Whether you take annual averages and then multiply it by the WARM, or whether you just add up all of the quarterly unannualized loss rates into one big aggregate number, different math, pretty much the same result. So I put together a little template on the next slide here that kind of explains an example of how math works. So let's say this is your used vehicle loans. And let's say you calculated your WARM after a prepayment assumption. So please don't forget the prepayment assumption is 3 years. And you've got data for, as you can see there, you had a 500 in net charge-offs in 2019, 300 in 2020, and 200 in 2021 on a balance of 100, 110, 120,000. Your net charge-off ratios for the last 3 years were 53 basis points, 29 basis points, and 17 basis points, right? But our tool is telling you that your loss rate is 99 basis points. And again, it's because it's not an average of those. It is an aggregate of those. So whether you take those 3 years and average them to say your average annual net charge-off ratio is 33 basis points, but then to get a lifetime, you multiply it by the WARM to get 99 basis points, we're simply saying, hey, we can be a little bit more accurate than that. Instead of averaging 3 large chunks of years, the most data, we get data every quarter. So the best calculation, the most precise calculation we can make here is look at the quarterly charge-offs over the entire look back period, right? So instead of taking a full year, we look at each of the quarters. We add up all the quarterly net charge-off ratios, not annualized, obviously, unannualized. And then you get a total sum aggregate loss rate of 99 basis points you see on the bottom right. That's the same thing, just different way of doing it as taking an average annual and then multiplying that by the WARM. Either way, you get the same result, a lifetime aggregate loss rate on the portfolio. And so that's just 2 different ways to kill that bird.
All right, we got a couple more questions, Steve. Are individually assessed loans continuing to be measured similar to FAS 114 logic, or does this change with CECL?
It's an excellent question. Yes and no.
Yeah, as I say,
Sean, yeah, what are your thoughts? And then I'll
I mean, I think, so this is where you get a little bit into theory and practice of what we've seen. Theoretically, FASB, when it was first introduced, said that FAS 114 and that whole analysis was going away. Yep. What we've seen in practice is it's not yet going away. And so that's why we have the individually assessed loans, because it appears it's been very clear that whether it's the regulators, the auditors, or even some of the boards themselves want to continue to define and identify and separate those out. In theory, CECL, because we had these longer life of loan concepts, the idea of impaired loans was supposed to go away because that longer lifetime would essentially capture the good, the bad, and the ugly. That may in fact happen over time, but I think for the immediate transition, your regulators, your auditors, your board will probably want you to continue to identify and specifically cull those out and, from the pools.
Now
Steve?
that threshold does not have to be, is not defined, is not well defined at all. The old threshold with FAS 5 versus FAS 114, the old definition of impairment, the concept of the TDR, all that stuff currently and historically gave you a pretty good idea of it. But the TDR is going the way of a dodo, and that old FAS 5 and FAS 114 is replaced by CECL. So the question is, when do I need to cull it from the herd and individually assess it? And there is no great, it's going to be trial and error, honestly. And what side of the bed, frankly, your auditor and examiner woke up on to begin with. But I would start with a high threshold, right? Because it is certainly more work to do so. And we've already, technically speaking, we've captured losses on the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly loans in our historical analysis, right? With the historical calculation that we do is not just of your past portfolio, right? It's not just of the general, it's of the entire portfolio, including all the bad loans. If you do too much individually assessed loans, you run the risk of not exactly double counting, because we are pulling the balance out, but maybe just doing a lot more work than you probably need to do. The best way they've defined it is, if a loan doesn't have any similar risk characteristics to any other loan in your portfolio, it needs to be a pool of one. So it needs to be, in effect, individually assessed. Like, a mortgage loan where the guy's in default and your foreclosure is imminent, and you value the property and you have an idea that it's turned 50,000 less than the note. You individually assess that, you have a good idea of what that loss might be, as an example.
Great. The next question was, is this tool accessible to us on the website, or can you send us the sheet? I'm not sure. Obviously CECLSolver is within the QuickRate website under the CECLSolver tool. This description that Steve just did, we will be sending a link to the recording and a copy of these slides. So you'll get this in that email that will, again, probably come on Monday or even potentially later this afternoon. Another thing that we continue to at least encounter in discussions with our credit unions is, if I want to drill down even further and segregate some of the pools that we have, identified, you can do that. We can assist you with it, but it clearly involves more information. So that's going to be incumbent upon you and your team being able to provide us with that additional information. So this is something that, again, we'll kind of continue to monitor and discuss. But just to let you know, again, we really believe in the portfolio solution, but we understand that there'll be instances where, whether it's the credit union or, you want to dig deeper, all of that's possible. But, again, it obviously requires more information than we're gleaning today from the call report. Another question came in. Are participation loans that have characteristics not similar to the remaining portfolio typically individually assessed? They certainly can be, right? If your participation has issues or has reason for impairment, yes, you can certainly separate and individually assess those. Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, but if you're talking about any individual loan, but if you're talking about your participation loans as a whole, do I need to take all, if I have, if my used auto portfolio is 50%, homegrown and 50% participations, do I have to segregate out and have the participations as a custom risk pool separate from the homegrown loans? And the answer to that is, well, how different are they? Are the risk characteristics, how different are those risk characteristics? And meaning, have they had a very different loss experience in the past as a whole? Do they represent very different potential losses in the future? If your participation used vehicle loans are in market from the same general area and haven't really performed that differently in the past, unless you have a reason to believe they're going to very much in the future, you sort of define them as not necessarily having to separate them out as a separate pool. There's a very real risk of over-segmenting under CECL, because how do you define similar risk characteristics, right? And do they have to be, if it had to be identical risk characteristics, every loan would be a pool of one, right? So you have to find somewhat similar risk characteristics. And if you have too many pools, you think it's, oh, this is more granular, this is more precise, this is definitely better. That is not necessarily the case at all. the more detailed or granular your buckets are, the less loans are in that bucket, the less data that we have, right, to look at long-term. And your long-term trend is based upon that one time Johnny missed that one payment 4 years ago, and it doesn't represent trends, right? We want to get a good bit of data so you can see trends over time, not just internally, but compare them to some objective external environmental trend as well, meaning looking at peer data, right? If you haven't had any losses in your mortgage portfolio over 7 years, but your peers have had, 40 basis points, we know that, you're going to be utilizing some of that peer data. If you've got 100 custom buckets, then you've got no external apples to apples comparative data to compare it to. So you end up with a data problem. And then I think that can become more problematic than helpful. So I would just say, I think the over segmentation and is a double-edged sword.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Next question, just again, kind of going on prepayment assumptions. This is a common question we're receiving as well. I think the point we wanted to emphasize here is, a defensible and supportable prepayment assumption is all that's necessary. You can work to be more specific. I'm not sure it materially helps you, but you can spend a lot of time and energy to do that. And again, practically speaking, I'm not sure it, makes a huge difference. The important thing to keep in mind is that any prepayment assumption is going to lower the WARM. So the higher the prepayment assumption, the lower the WARM. The more conservative is the lower prepayment assumption is going to give you a higher WARM. So again, whether it's 10 or 11 is probably less important, and trying to get to that level of detail. Steve, anything you want to add here?
Yeah. So, doing prepayment speed calculations is another level of complexity using your loan. You have to have very good, very well documented loan level data. And it's more difficult than doing a WARM calculation on your individual loan data because, to do a basic WARM calculation, not, ignoring prepayments and just a contractual maturity WARM calculation, all you really need is balance data and maturity date information on the entire call report bucket as of this date and maybe as of another date. Whereas to really track prepayment speeds over time, you've got to track all the individual loans over a period of time, not the entire bucket. And so it can be a big data rabbit hole to go down. And even after you spend all that time and energy doing it, assuming you can't get one from somewhere else, from your ALM provider or something, that's still only half the battle because they're not asking you for from a CECL perspective, they're not asking you what was your prepayments over the last 6 months of last year. They're asking you what is your projection of future prepayments on this segment of the portfolio. So you do a very detailed historical calculation, you still don't have a prepayment estimate that's forward looking. And since it's pretty challenging to estimate long-term future when it comes to that, we think a more defensible, and just happens to be easier, but approach is to look at long-term industry trends on prepayments and average that out in order to get what is in effect your long-term future prepayment assumption. So that's exactly what we did. We went to go try to find some sort of industry data that showed us some reasonable, reliable, defensible long-term trends in prepayments. For the mortgage industry, it's relatively straightforward. We got this from the FHFA. They have a prepayment monitoring report, pretty aptly named, that they put out each quarter and update each quarter. And it's got this chart, for example, is on page 5, I think, of that prepayment monitoring report each quarter. It shows long-term national average trends in prepayment speeds for mortgage-related loans. So this is a great defensible starting point for your prepayment rate. Where do you think on this spectrum it should be? It's a good question. It's been as low as, between 5 and 10% in the last 5 years. It's been as high as 35% annual prepayment rates on mortgage loans across the country in the last 18 months. So if you average that out, you would get somewhere in the 15 to 20% annual or annualized prepayment rate on mortgage loans. So that's why we think that is a really good starting point. if you want to use your own loan level data or you have access to prepayment speeds and studies on your data, certainly take it into account. But you should, as much, if not more, be taking this long-term trend into account.
Great.
And this is for non-mortgage related loans. What about the rest of the portfolio? Well, that's not going to come from the FHFA. So we were able to find some data from the Fed. So the Federal Reserve started tracking and making assumptions about prepayment rates for these other loan types when they built the TALF facility after the last credit crisis, and has continued to update these things on their site. So there's a link to it there, so you can defend it. And they look at auto loans, equipment loans, small business loans, student loans. And here they're using not the CPR is an annualized, that's the conditional or constant prepayment rate, is an annualized number already. ABS is a monthly calculation. It's an absolute prepayment speed, and it's a monthly one that you need to annualize. So multiply it by 12, 1.5% monthly on subprime auto annualized is about 18%. It just so happens to be a coincidence that the data and guidance we're providing for non-mortgage related loans is also in that 15 to 20% annual prepayment rate, just like the mortgage loans are. So that's some updated guidance that we're providing now, and suggesting that if you have done a CECL calculation, maybe using our tool, and the numbers seem higher than you would ideally like them to be or believe they should be, the first thing you're going to want to check is that. Go into your WARM calculations and see what prepayment assumption you made. And if it's something like 5 or 10%, bump it up to 15 or 20% now that you have some defense of that. And that will bring the WARMs down. And all things being equal, a shorter WARM leads to a lower reserve requirement, right? CECL is about estimating losses or providing for all the losses over the remaining life of the pool. So the longer the remaining life of the pool is, the longer the time is they have to aggregate losses over that lifetime, and the higher the reserve, and vice versa. So don't shoot yourself in the foot with CECL by underestimating your prepayment assumptions.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Certainly submit questions that you have or haven't asked yet. Just a couple of reminders. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to really probably, as we continue to do these coffee talks, probably entertain more questions as you dive into it, just about, things that you're encountering, such as the ones we discussed today. To make these as helpful as possible, if you have something you'd like us to discuss, please submit those to us, and we will, take those into account and try to present those so we can share those with the broader audience. Next month, we'll have a coffee talk for those of you who've been repeat attendees. Paul Allen from Saltmarsh CPA firm is going to join us again. Paul, we had a great coffee talk with him a few months ago. He's agreed to come back and join us next month. So we're very excited to have Paul. So think about questions that you might want to ask of him. We do have a demo of the CECLSolver here later this month on the 22nd. For any of you who are new to our coffee talks, Steve will do an in-depth dive into the CECLSolver tool on September 22nd. In the interim, if you have any questions, you can certainly submit those to info@quickrate.com. Reach out to David and Jason, set up a demo if you want, or a discussion. We'll again kind of to support you and continue to support you as we make this transition to CECL. So I'm going to check for any final questions. I don't see any on behalf, or Steve, any final comments before we let everybody get back to their day?
No, it's Friday afternoon, so everyone, thanks for joining us, and enjoy your weekends, unless anyone has anything else that they've just thought of.
Yeah, no, Amanda, thank you very much for joining us today. She just thanked us for having this today.
Sure.
Again, on behalf of Steve and all of us here at QwickRate, thank you very much for attending. Thanks for working with us on the CECLSolver. We'll be back next month with another edition, and we hope you have a great day and weekend. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.